Now, there's a couple of ways that we can go about this, depending on sort of how many people show up. The one route is sort of the more typical town hall. People field questions, we answer them, so on and so forth. The other one is more of a focus group or group conversation that we can kind of share on the whole. And so the idea being that either which way it goes, we're able to glean some of your perspectives as graduate students or people out in the broader university community, so that I can bring them back to the Academic Restructuring Working Group, or so that we can help to sort of determine what some of the thought process, common questions are, and what some of the answers may be for future communications. So with that kind of preamble done, I think that it's safe that we can kind of, get this rolling. I am joined by our directly elected officer group who may have updates more specific to their portfolios where they may chime in as needed. So to get started, very important, I would like to acknowledge you may be joining from elsewhere in the world. I am joining you all from Treaty 6 territory, ancestral homelands of a number of Indigenous bands, as well as the Métis Nation. My name is Mark Waddingham. I use he, him pronouns. They, them is also acceptable by me. And I'm the president of the Graduate Students Association here at the University of Alberta. I think it's important that we just sort of preface some of this conversation with sort of how we got here, what work has been done, and so on and so forth. So as many of you may have noted from the email that was sent or other communications, this town hall is just part of our ongoing outreach efforts to graduate students related to the University for Alberta, or University of Alberta for Tomorrow initiative. The UAT is split between two different portions. On one hand is the Service Excellence Transformation Initiative, or SET as it's called. And the other one is the Academic Restructuring Working Group, of which I sit on as the graduate student representative. Now, you probably have seen there has been an interim report that was just released last week that sort of details from the Academic Restructuring Working Group specifically, that details some of the findings, proposals, data utilized, deliberations, consultations that have occurred up until this point. And so it's a pretty natural spot now to have some of these conversations related to the findings of that report, conversations from town hall, the town halls, general faculties council, and other venues that have been taking place related to UAT. So with that in mind, you have me here in the hot seat for a little bit of time. So if anybody has opening questions, I think we're glad to both do it through chat. Of course, I'll be monitoring my emails here and there, or you're welcome to obviously turn on your camera and speak. And realistically, we can structure this as more of a conversation with ample time for questions, answers, follow-ups, and so on and so forth. And hopefully this will be the first of many such events during our tenure. So with that in mind, is there anybody who would like to take a start at asking some questions?
Everyone.
And I know it's kind of difficult to sometimes kick it off, but realistically, as your representative, we're very receptive to any input, feedback, or perspectives that you may have on UAT or work of the GSA more generally. So if you just need a couple of moments to sort of formulate the first round of questions, that's great. Of course, the chat box is available for you. You can use the blue hand as part of the participants window. That works fine as well. So there are a few different ways in which, if you have comment, that you can contribute. Otherwise, I'm glad to kind of continue to expand on some of the work that academic restructuring is going on with. I'm glad to sort of discuss or explore some of the different scenarios that are present in the ARWG interim report, or really any combination of those approaches. So at this point, it's up to the audience, I would say. Or if the DEOs have a question that they've heard from their constituencies that they would like to raise. And I see Maura would like to go ahead, so please.
Hi, yes, thank you so much for having this town hall. It's a really great opportunity, I think, for graduate students to also get a sense of how this restructuring is going to impact us, as many of us will be here for a long time. And I've been at a few other sessions where it's been predominantly faculty, and so hearing faculty concerns are very different, of course, from graduate student concerns. So, and I guess, yeah, I still feel, despite my trying to get a handle on what's going on, I still feel pretty in the dark about what is going to happen for grad students, or what's on the table, what, for example, you're representing the interests of the graduate students at the ARWG Council, or AWRG, whatever it is. Yeah, so I guess if you could just speak a bit more about all of those things, because it's a bit perplexing.
Yeah, and you're not wrong, and it's a great question. And like I said, this is hopefully going to be, this won't be a one and done event. It would be nice for it to grow and get more feedback and input. So of course, that was part of ensuring that those voices are being represented. So really, what does restructuring mean for graduate students? And I think that the answer to that is it's not entirely clear yet, and I'll elaborate. Right now, the status of the working group as described in the interim report is really dealing with the large scale institutional structure. So when we think about faculties and how they might be arranged, conglomerated, and that's obviously a very active realm of conversation, that doesn't really get down to the departmental or the program level. And so realistically, I guess I can answer this in two questions. One is sort of based off of like research areas, and one is based off of programs. And so in terms of research areas, especially for those in thesis-based studies who have a professor who's supervising their work, the effect on that side of the student experience should appear fairly minimal from my understanding, because the professor is there, they have research grants, they're pursuing a specific line of inquiry, on tenure track, and they have students that are supporting that work. So realistically, we shouldn't expect to see too much disruption on that front. On the program sides of things, there may be a little bit more of an open question, right? But realistically, and we've seen, it was supposed to be done at General Faculties Council this week, but it's been delayed until October, that when it does come time, say, for instance, on the very sort of extreme end, you have a program that is going to be suspended or terminated or something of this nature, that process is quite lengthy. And in all of the cases that I'm aware of when that's happened, that students that are in that program will graduate that program and they'll just sort of pause admissions. But people who are in that program should not see any disruption. In my undergraduate, actually, I was one of those individuals, as my specialization program for microbiology in the Faculty of Science was eventually, it went that way, that it was suspended, and they introduced some new programs to align more closely with current research activity and faculty cohort within my department. So that's kind of the beginning part of the question. The second part, in sort of going forward, as we start to discuss some more of this nitty gritty, some more of these sort of more departmental or research focused areas, and realistically, some of the information that we've received both at Graduate Students Association Council, but also in some of the town halls as well, is this promise or this commitment that as resources, be it personnel or capital or space or however that looks, are made available within the university structure, that will go towards frontline activities, i.e. research and teaching, of which graduate students, of course, as teaching assistants and research assistants and research assistants fellows are really, we're right there. And so there's obviously a lot of discussion about how can we ensure that that's being done. The other thing that's part of this process is that we're looking towards a standardization of an excellent graduate student experience for those items or those objects that can be controlled for at an institutional level. Funding is probably one of the most obvious examples of this. We have colleagues over in, say, Faculty of Arts. I'm coming from Faculty of Science, Department of Biology specifically, where, for instance, in my department, we have funding all year round, January to December, for the 2.3 years for master's students or 4.5 years for PhD students. However, in certain units, and specifically some departments in arts, for example, they'll only have funding from September to end of April, and then they have to figure out what they're doing during the summer months because there may not be an RA-ship or a TA-ship available for them during that period. So those are some of the questions that are now just starting to be explored as it relates to that really, you know, moving beyond the faculty level, moving into the departmental level. And that's sort of what the next, next round of discussion at that table is going to look like. And those are some of the things that we're looking to champion, right? Making sure that resources are distributed equitably for graduate students, ensuring that that experience for graduate students on campus is of the highest quality possible. This ties into some of our other strategic work that's unrelated to University of Alberta for tomorrow, but we'll put that off to the side for now. But also furthermore, that for those programs, once those discussions start happening, if there are audits that might occur, that standard practice is followed, that there's just a freeze on admissions to a given program. Individuals in that program are permitted to go through to graduation, and then we have the conversation of what do we do with that kind of after the fact, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And then I would just ask, is there sort of is there something else you would like me to touch on related to that, or does that sort of encapsulate some questions about some of the values going into the restructuring project from a graduate student perspective, and also the process itself?
Yeah, I think that touches on some of the initial thoughts and questions that I have. I guess another question would just be in terms of solidarities amongst different groups of people. Of course, graduate students are one represented body, of which you are the person. But just thinking about, for example, like non-academic staff and what's happening for them, what may or may not be happening to different faculties, because I'm coming from arts, I'm the political science rep on GSA Council, and so there are conversations about what will happen to our departments and how they are going to be reorganized, and then thinking about different kinds of solidarities depending on what happens through the restructuring. So I just wonder if the GSA is thinking about any of those moves as well, because of course NASA is being hit really hard. And like you say, we don't yet know what's going to happen for grad students. So just thinking about those kinds of relationships as well.
Right, and I think that's it's a really fair point. And for instance, at our board, we've had some conversation from some of our board members who have raised the issue that we're losing frontline staff, like staff that would be covered under NASA, that are essential for research activities, as an example, technicians in labs or in certain types of fabrication shops. I mean, obviously I'm speaking more from kind of a STEM side of things, but that's an example of where we might see what happened to the libraries, for instance, with the Coots and Winspear libraries. Obviously impacts to some degree NASA staff, but also is a diminishment of our facilities that many students rely upon. So we're very sensitive to that. We haven't engaged in any kind of like formal agreement with NASA, but we do, well, at least myself as president meets with the president of NASA and ASHWA on a regular basis alongside the president of the Postdoctoral Fellows Association and Students Union, where we do engage in information sharing, where we ensure that some of those perspectives from, say, like NASA or ASHWA, or people who are not at the table, are being implemented in our processes as we're advocating for students. And that I agree that as we go forward with more budget cuts and as more non-academic staff are laid off, particularly obviously the group who is most at risk, of course, that we need to find and advocate for ways to ensure that, you know, that doesn't impact the student experience. Of course, many of those staff are frontline that interface directly with students. We need to ensure that during the process of restructuring that we are able to maintain personnel whenever possible. And I believe this has been, I know that President Flanagan has been very vocal about this, with his statement largely being, you know, we kind of have a choice. We can either sort of strategically manage the budget cuts that are coming to us, or we continue to do 1,000 different cuts in 1,000 different locations, which realistically would probably result in more staff terminations from my reading of the situation. But it also would lead to terminations in ways that, you know, are simply going to diminish our ability to provide student services, to provide academic support services, and so on and so forth. And again, this is where we start to get into complexity about, you know, either straying too far into another group's mandate, but we do meet with them and we do ensure that we're incorporating some of their feedback, because we don't want to see, I mean, nobody wants to see these types of layoffs. But at some level, they're kind of out of our hand just regarding certain governmental direction as it relates to public spending.
Thanks. I wonder, I don't want to take up too much of your time by just bothering you with many questions. But if I could ask just one more follow-up to that, in terms, I guess, of it being a primarily external imposition for the restructuring through us, like a budgetary austerity measure, is there anything on the table to kind of respond or push back towards those demands that are being asked of the U of A? But of course, every publicly funded university institution in Alberta, because I was at the presentation for the Alberta, oh gosh, I forget, but the working group between a number of different universities through the province. And so I'm wondering if there's anything strategically that you're talking about to kind of push back or resist the cuts that are being asked.
Yeah, so that's that leans more on the external side of things. So realistically, we kind of have two routes, right? We have advocacy and we have direct action. And at least for the UA GSA, when it comes to direct action, the reality is, and this is more in Umesh's portfolio, so he may want to comment, but generally speaking, due to the sort of siloed and separated nature of graduate studies on campus, really not even just down to the departmental level, but really just by research area, group by group, it's proven to be very difficult to you know, sort of generate the type of movement that we would need for, like, say, you know, like a graduate student strike. On top of that, there are financial implications for those who go on strike. Of course, we would need something like a strike fund. So right now, from my understanding of those conversations, and Umesh would be the person who's most prepared to speak on that, it's not necessarily in the works on that front. On the advocacy front, though, so I think there's a couple of issues there. Is that one, when it comes to that form of pushback on the government, we were very successful in the last year, and this is the Alberta Graduate Provincial Advocacy Council, who was kind of the tip of the spear on this on the student side, that did a lot of work to, for instance, stop the rollout of the performance-based funding system in that iteration, and also the expenditure targets that would have been introduced with it, that would have done far more than the budgetary cuts and did by themselves. So we did push back rather hard on that, and from the student perspective, we did manage to interrupt that process. But it was actually, interestingly, a more broader pushback from the sector at large. Now, we're in the context of Alberta Vision 2030, Skills for Jobs, system-wide review, never minding the sort of problematic nature of that name. And yes, it has been pointed out to the minister a couple of times about that. They are doing a series of roundtables of which we have representation at, as does the faculty, as does the university administration, as do the undergraduate students and the polytechnic students and other stakeholder groups as well. And right now, that process is still ongoing. So you may have heard this is a review that's being done by McKinsey & Company as the consultant that won the contract for that one. We'll have to wait and see, but realistically, depending on what comes out of that, we may see a similar level of pushback as we saw with the performance-based funding, not only because the performance-based funding system is, being discussed in the context of the system-wide review, but also because depending on what other recommendations come out of that, and we're not really at liberty to discuss too much of what's taking place, and realistically, we're not necessarily at a lot of those tables. We kind of delegate that to people who need to be in the know to ensure, effectiveness and efficiency in those proceedings. But it wouldn't be unheard of to see similar levels of institutional organizational pushback as we've seen with, say, the Alberta Medical Association, or what's occurring with the public school boards, for instance. And I think it's worth pointing out that this review is really quite a sensitive pressure point for a lot of people, both because of the budgetary cuts, but also because of what it means for post-secondary going forward. So that's a little bit beyond the scope of University of Alberta for tomorrow, but I'm glad to speak on it because it is a really important piece of other strategic priorities.
Thank you. Yeah, because I don't see them as being disconnected. So no, it's helpful
not at all.
Those things. Yeah.
And actually, I would just comment on that for a moment, in which to say, and this has been something about the messaging or communication about University of Alberta for tomorrow that I think it really needs to be discussed, which is, were the budget cuts sort of the precipitating factor to engage in this initiative? Yes, it's pretty undeniable that that's the case. You wouldn't do something like this if everything was going rosy and you were receiving your 5% increased allotment to your Campus Alberta grant year over year, right? That being said, though, it seems to me, and we pointed this out a few times, that when you kind of look at the way that the university is organized, when you look at the way the different departments have and faculties have sort of grown and spread and sort of filled the available space, that has led to some lack of really logical, consistent organization, both in terms of size of different units, in terms of where certain units live, in terms of how interdisciplinarity works or doesn't work, as says someone who's coming from an interdisciplinary research group, and that needs to be addressed anyway. So the fiscal situation provides us an opportunity to have those conversations and to do work that needs to be done anyway that wouldn't have been done in absence of the budget cuts. So I disagree with the way that the cuts were handed out. I have personally told the minister directly, hey, I understand what it is that you have to do here, but realistically, this is not necessarily the best way to sort of steward the system. And other people have told him that as well, of course. But more to the point, that now this has given us this sort of framework or the stage for which to a jumping off point to continue these conversations. So we got to do it for bigger reasons, but you are right that yes, that there's a timeline that should be acknowledged.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you. Those are excellent questions. So I'll look to some of our other members here. So we're going to sort of run this as more of a conversation focus group initial foray to sort of gauge what some of the perspectives are from the graduate student body. And yeah, was there any other thoughts? And I'll also say if the DEOs have questions or comments that they want to add, that they can also raise their hand as well and maybe help guide some of that conversation. Sachiketa, go ahead.
Thank you, Mark. So as a part of academic restructuring, we can expect the changes of our academic leaders too, right? Of the different faculties.
Yes.
So will this affect the composition of graduates, student associations, or any student bodies?
Yeah, so that's a more complicated question to answer. We're not necessarily at that point yet. I would say that, so our graduate student associations generally fall along departmental lines with sort of shared requirements around professional development or course offerings, and obviously they tend to have, there is a degree of logical sense in the way that certain departments are constructed, right? Department of Biology, everyone is doing biology, although we may quibble about, how related some of these fields are related to other fields on campus, but put that off to the side for now. So I think that realistically, a graduate student association, as per our bylaw and policy, is not limited to or restricted by needing to be in a department. Realistically, we have requirements on membership, how many graduate students as a proportion need to be about, its purpose, it needs to be academic, of course, and some other stipulations. So at least from our end, I don't necessarily see either like a reorganization of faculty members or departments or however you want, like at this more granular level, which I'll stress has not been discussed yet at the restructuring working group. But what I would say is that it would not necessitate a change in the way the graduate student associations organize themselves on campus, because that has more to do, our bylaws don't have stipulations that say it has to fall under like, for example, the Indigenous Graduate Students Association, as an example. Of course, they represent a specific constituency on campus along sort of more ethnic and historical lines, but they're not set within a specific departmental home, right? They're not all members of the Faculty of Native Studies. One of their executives who I speak with occasionally is in the Faculty of Nursing, for instance, right? But they have a commonality that they've come together and they have explicit graduate academic focus, and they do advocacy work on behalf of their members and so on and so forth. So it's a great question, but from our perspective, we would not necessarily see that diminishment unless it came around to the point that different graduate student associations kind of look around to each other and go, okay, well, if this is the direction that this is going, then we actually might benefit from uniting our voices together here or collaborating in some way, but that would be up to their discretion. There would be nothing from the top down that would compel that kind of action. Yeah, it's a great question. Okay, other thoughts, questions? Anis has something to add in.
I actually have a question, Mark.
Of course.
My question is related to EDI and the restructuring, especially administrative restructuring. I mean, of course, that's definitely going to impact EDI.
Right.
And what are we doing as GSA executives? What are we doing about that to kind of address that?
Right. So EDI, equity, diversity, inclusivity, quite a hot topic on campus these days. And I do believe there is a lot of very legitimate work that's being done on that front. And what I would say to that is that, so it's and I do apologize that I am receiving notifications from one of the lab Slack groups, and I will deal with that right now before I continue. Give me one moment. There we go. So what I would say to that is that it really is a institutional priority that is enshrined through work that's being done in the provost's office, but also being done in a selection of, I believe, within a few dean's offices on campus. School of Business and Faculty of Science come to mind, where they have either associate or assistant deans of EDI already implemented into their leadership structures. When we look towards some of the proposed sort of like straw models for how, say, like there's the division model, which is scenario B in the interim report, that also sort of illustrates where different leadership positions may go in there. And it has been pretty explicitly kept on the table. Now, it's really important to acknowledge that in the context of the budgetary restrictions and the budget cuts, and I've spoken with members sort of within my own academic home in the Faculty of Science about this, that it does appear to be, though, that when sort of push comes to shove and they need to close positions here and there, it appears as though, first of all, those in more precarious positions, like say sessional instructors, who tend to be of a more diverse demographic background than say full tenured staff, it should probably be noted, that obviously they are at risk of precarity during budget reductions, that those positions tend to be closed first. So that's obviously a problem. People who are seconded to EDI initiatives or work or portfolios within some units will sometimes see those secondments ended or closed and resources reallocated when push comes to shove, which kind of demonstrates maybe a lack of consistency across the institution regarding the importance of these initiatives. So we have to point that out, and that has been raised to me by friends, colleagues, and constituents a number of times. That being said, though, when we do look at some of the proposed structures, and when we look at what the leadership, and when we look at where some of these different positions are going to live, positions that embody some element of equity, diversity, and inclusivity are being considered. And the Deputy Provost's office is, I mean, they're the point people on this when it comes to institutional priorities. And I do think that we should expect to see that faithfully represented going forward, and we'll ensure that that's being done. And of course, that's sort of secondary to some of the work that we're doing for equity, diversity, and inclusivity, notably supporting groups like the Indigenous Graduate Students Association and Black Graduate Students Association as they pursue their own advocacy routes. But that's kind of separate from institutional reorganization.
Yeah, thank you, Mark.
Not a problem. So going back to some of our public members who are joining us here today. So Andre and Logan, I'm wondering if there's any questions or things that you would like to hear about. And if not, we can always look back to Maura, who might have something additional to add as well. We'll kind of keep it more conversational and more of a focus group. And I might even have questions for you all if necessary. So we can either do this the way that I will answer your questions, or you can answer mine, and I'm fine with both. Andre, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mark, for the opportunity. It's been very informative and for some of the questions that I have. And touching on one of the topics that you said at the beginning, when this restructuring occurs and maybe we will have some department that won't exist anymore. So can we decide when that process occurs if we stick into this program or we move to the other one, or is something that we are going to be imposed?
So the thing is that those conversations have not really reached a level of maturity just yet. That's actually the next stage of the Academic Restructuring Working Group conversation. Of course, we'll have to deal with some of the feedback and input and what have you from the release of the interim report. However, the question about distinct programs, research areas, I guess what I would say as it relates to graduate students on campus is that graduate studies are, of course, very different from undergraduate studies. Even if we look at course-based master's programs, how they operate is and sort of the requirements for their degrees and things like the projects that they have to put together, or the certifications that they receive, and so on and so forth, that's very different. So when we're talking about things regarding, so basically and I guess I would just ask a question first, Andre, are you a thesis-based student or course-based student?
I'm a thesis-based student.
Okay, so when it comes to sort of thesis-based work in some of the research activity on campus, if you are associated with a faculty member who is doing research, who is receiving funding, who has space on campus and all this sort of thing, there's a good chance that that's going to continue sort of unabated. Now, of course, there are concerns about things like, brain drain, if some members of the faculty choose to depart, and what that means for their students. That's something we have to have a conversation about. Obviously there are concerns for those who occupy more niche fields, or maybe those who are not very well represented within their current departmental structure. Is there a risk of getting pushed out or denied space or funding in some way? Those are conversations we need to have. And I come from that crop of microbiology in the Department of Bioscience, where we were from 7 professors not too long ago, and now we're down to 4. So, there's obviously some risk there, and it's fluctuated. So as someone who's part of a group that represents something of that endangered species mold, what I would say is that, if you have funding, if you have space, if you have a prof who's sticking around, you're probably going to be secure in that. Your program is not going to close overnight. People who are in a program, even if it's a PhD program, in which case it has more to do with the PhD student themselves than it does with how many people are in program X, right? Because there are some graduate studies, like for instance, microbiology and biotech, where we have, like, if I'm not mistaken, something like 15 to 20 graduate students under that header. And so that's common enough. Like, we have 500 plus graduate programs at the U of A, and that's really reflective of a lot of the diversity that's represented in the research directions of the faculty. So it's a concern that I'm really glad to bring up and get some more concrete answers on. But my sense is that, you have people here who are working for these programs, who have already been admitted, who are already doing the research, writing the theses, so on and so forth. And so the expectation is that they would be permitted to continue to the end of that guaranteed process. And we'll ensure that we'll do our best to communicate that and ensure that is something that will be brought forward.
Okay, thank you so much. And the other question that I have is, in last week's report, we have 3 scenarios of the restructuring program. The GSA, like on your leadership, is going to consult to us which scenario do we prefer, or are you going to have a vote in the committee?
So the situation with the scenarios, and so my stance has largely been one of whichever scenario is chosen, we just need to ensure that the overall trajectory or arc of the restructuring project is one that benefits graduate students. Because the thing is that really at this point, these scenarios will be sort of voted upon, decided upon, deliberated upon by General Faculties Council, who will ultimately be the ones with the final sort of say on it, because the faculty members kind of have, like we have a lot at stake, but they kind of have the most at stake, if you know what I mean. And so I think that what we can do, and I think this is the beginning of these conversations, when it comes to those really high level faculty organizations, those are mainly going to be driven by issues of economy of scale, the uniting of doctrines, disciplines, and technical capacities that make sense to bring together. I often point out that, it's kind of interesting. We have a Department of Biochemistry over in Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry, and we have the departments of Chemistry and Biology over in Faculty of Science, right? And so you can kind of see where, obviously we have some shared commonality in the research that we do, especially in terms of the discipline and techniques that we utilize. However, we're very separate, and realistically, I've only ever spoken to one person over at in biochem as a microbiologist. So obviously we have a lot of shared skin with them. So with that being said, though, I would say that when it starts to come down to the sort of departmental and program level, it's really going to be, in my opinion, up to the students in those units to drive those conversations. Because of course, as the UAGSA, we are going to drive those sort of larger scale institutional priorities. We're going to take as much input as we possibly can, or as much as is offered. But we, when it comes down to some of those nitty gritty elements, when we start to talk about departments and their organization and where faculty members are, those conversations still need to happen. And I'll be keeping like sort of a close ear on that front to ensure that whatever those outcomes are, the graduate students are still permitted to continue forward with the research that they've already, performed and this, how far they've reached in milestones for their degree and so on and so forth. But when it comes down to those other elements, it really will be a collaboration between graduate students and their sort of, supervising professor or the department or the program that they align with, to be part of those conversations on the ground. And that's where grassroots student advocacy becomes really important, because we can try and mitigate as much as we can at the top level, but admittedly, a lot of that work is going to be done in that's going to, all of those venues are just simply going to surpass our capacity at the central UAGSA. So those would be kind of my comments on that. So when it comes to these scenarios, like personally, as an individual, I think that there's something like scenario B. Now I've heard some of the criticism and feedback and conversation about that specific model, and I'm obviously interested in revisiting some of my assumptions and what I saw in it. But I do think that that decision will rest with the faculty, simply because they kind of have like, the most at risk in terms of their careers, research trajectories, working groups, and so on and so forth. Doesn't mean not to get involved. Of course, we should all be getting involved as much as we're able to at that, at those ground levels. And if, for instance, you're not being included in those conversations, that's when you come and speak with us, and we'll kind of do what we can to facilitate that for you.
Okay, Mark, thanks so much. It will really help.
Yeah, it's a great question. Um, so we just had a comment from Logan come in, and it's, could you comment on the general support for the restructuring from the STEM field? So there's a couple of different ways that we can take that. So is this sort of in comment to some of those amalgamation models where we're kind of combining science, ALS, and engineering? Is that kind of where it's coming from? Or where there might be some support for different disciplines within science, technology, engineering, and mathematics to come together? Is that sort of where we're going? I guess I'm just asking for just a little bit of a clarity or which direction you would like me to take this comment or question rather. And just give. I see what you're saying. Yes. And so I think, so kind of at a broad level, and it's sort of difficult to substantiate definitively, but from my experience, I think a lot of the concern from the social sciences and hearing from colleagues over on that, and like I understand Faculty of Sciences had like a town hall related to this. I understand that the tone was, unfortunately I wasn't present, so I can't comment firsthand, but from the individual I spoke to that, you know, there was this sort of sense of like there was a great diminishment of the faculty in its work, that there was a lot of concern about how many programs would survive and things of this nature. And so I think what we're sort of seeing is historical factors from budgetary pressures on faculty of arts and funding for arts in general at the University of Alberta, and of course largely due to like, you know, where are donations from specific industry or private sector or philanthropic avenues coming from, and where they go on campus, and how that kind of leads to somewhat of an inequality. So there's sort of that historical valence that I think is definitely feeding into it and is 100% valid, of course. In terms of STEM though, actually, you would think so, but there is also derision on that side as well. So I'll just give an example that maybe sort of illustrates what I mean. So at General Faculties Council yesterday, one of the combinations under the scenario B, the division model, is to one of the, you know, it's a tri-council agency alignment. So anybody who predominantly receives funding from, you know, Canadian Institutes of Health Research, they fall into one bucket. Those who receive it predominantly from the Science and Engineering Research Council, and those who fall into the Social Sciences and Humanities agency would have their own. But it was actually raised from a professor from my department, actually, and I agree with him in some ways, that there would be a really grand concern with, say, combining the Faculty of Science with the Faculty of Engineering within one of these models. And the reason why he raised it is he's like, well, you know, I'm paraphrasing here, but the incentives that are at play for the type of scientific, you know, primary discovery-based scientific research we do in the Faculty of Science versus the sort of more, sometimes more commercial, oftentimes more industrial, obviously a big focus on sort of innovation and working through like co-op programs with the private sector, where those might come into conflict. And he deliberately pointed out, for instance, the Suzuki affair that happened a couple of years ago now, which I remember very vividly in my mind. And so he raises a really good point where you would think that science and engineering might be a natural pair, but actually there's a reason why we see more commonly arts and science groupings kind of throughout North America and parts of Europe as well. And the reason for that is because there are different incentives at play. So what I would comment on that is that while you would think that, you know, we would see less dissent from the science side of things, like, you know, as I pointed out, like, you know, my long lost comrades over in biochemistry, you know, they're all the way over there. There's so much beautiful collaboration that could be happening. That would be an example. Maybe there would be more commonality, although they're more medically oriented just because they're in a medical faculty. But there are very valid and substantive concerns about combinations of certain elements of the faculties at play. So maybe that answers your question to a degree. because I thought the same thing. I was thinking like, yeah, you know, engineering science, there's kind of, you know, enough there. But then as I kind of thought about it and had conversations with people, and when Dr. Allison yesterday made his comment at GFC, I kind of went, you know, he's not wrong. Like maybe there's something to this division-based model, but maybe this specific combination may not be the best fit. And I think that there's a lot of validity to those statements. But I certainly do feel for those who are sort of on the humanities or social sciences side of things, because I think that they're, like, we have seen combinations of certain departments and things of this nature in the past. And I just think that, you know, it's important to recognize that a lot of that concern has a very valid historical basis. And I think that we don't do ourselves any favors by not acknowledging that, because it is true in, especially in certain in certain private circles, there's a lot of question about the value that social sciences brings. And what I often, and even calling it social sciences is almost, you know, that's almost derisive in its own right. As an example, my brother has a degree in political science. And he's like, I don't have a degree in political science. I have a degree in political philosophy. They completely misnamed it. So it's just one of those perspectives that I think is really valid. And we do need to explore that a little more thoroughly, why people have some of those misgivings. So I do notice that, so we'll kind of like go back around the circle. So Maura, Andre, if you have something that you thought about it that you would like to add at this juncture with some of this new information and conversation, we'd be glad to hear from you. I do notice we have someone else joining us who may have a question, and we can try and bring them up to speed as best as we're able to. But yeah, we'll just kind of go back around if anybody else has any thoughts, or really if you have perspectives or information that you need me to be aware of and take forward. I'm also just glad to hear sort of opinions or takes on the restructuring process as well, because I'm kind of, my perspective is skewed because I'm so close to the work. So it's really good to have that opportunity to hear perspectives from outside of ourselves, because of course, you know, otherwise I'm not necessarily going to hear it, so.
If I may try in, Mark, like just following what you said about this restructuring, and then the idea of like the bias against social sciences, humanities, and also or engineering. I think if we are adopting the Australian model or the UK model, taking for example Australia into consideration, this restructuring has always impacted social sciences and humanities more than engineering and say medicine, because as I agree with Mark, as Mark said, it's very hard to kind of combine engineering with science. But for social sciences and humanities education, it is certainly the case. And then take, for example, any university in Australia that went through restructuring, the University of South Australia, for example, they just created a new school of creative industries. So in these schools, what they did, they first of all got rid of all these centers, Center of Islamic Studies, Center of African Studies, or whatever that area studies. They just got rid of all this. And then when you get rid of these centers, so the administrative staff associated with it also, you kind of offset that. So you no longer have to pay any staff or whatever. And then they combine together humanities with social sciences under the name of creative industries, programs and stuff. So I'm not sure if they really can do that for science and engineering. It's going to be very, very hard to combine the thematics.
Yeah, and if I may just clarify, and I would just like to welcome Alex, who has his audio now synced up. So hello, Alex. Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark, the president of the Graduate Students Association. Him works just fine. And we're just on the topic of academic restructuring more broadly. We've covered a little bit of ground so far, but if you do have questions or comments that you may have come in prepared with, you can use the blue hand or the chat function as you prefer. But just to respond to Anis's point, which is, and just to clarify maybe some perspectives on this. So I think what's important to note is that the model, we're not adopting any specific model. We're not adopting a UK model. We're not adopting an Australian model. those data and examples come from the Nous Group, which is it's a private consultancy firm that's based primarily in Australia, but they do have an office in Toronto, I believe it is, who has done some of this restructuring work in the past and is one of these sort of experts in how this process works, what it means sort of in a more quantitative sense going forward. But what I would say is that my understanding, and for example, University of Sydney has been raised as an example of one of those parts of the data set that where the student experience deteriorated as a result of the restructuring. And I know that there was a bit of a sort of a panel conversation that was hosted on that topic. And what I would say is that, you know, the University of Sydney represents one data point of many data points, but that realistically, and this was something that the consultants with Nous had made very, very clear, which they're like, look, we can provide you with some strategies, we can provide you with some information, we can show you that yes, there is, you know, you can survive this kind of process, but that ultimately it's going to be occurring on your terms. Ultimately, you're going to be responsible for it. And that what we're just trying to do is just help you answer the questions that you may have in a way that will allow you to make more informed decisions through the process. And what I would say about the U of A process insofar, and that I was really pleasantly surprised with, is that it has been very, like a lot of people have sort of dubious questions about the value of consultation, you know, how much is actually taken into account, what impacts on is my opinion or input having in this process. And say, if you're like me, dealing with the provincial government last year, I would have, I mean, that was the boat I was in doing that advocacy work, and a boat that I'm still in doing this advocacy work. But when it comes to this process, it does, from what I've seen, that just the number of consultations that they're doing and the amount of avenues for feedback, and now the next wave of conversations, like we had the provost office reach back out to us and say, hey, we would like to do another touch base with the GSA Council. So which means we're going to have an opportunity to meet with the provost, and possibly the president will be coming to our council twice in the span of 3 months, which is unprecedented. I believe I can't, in my term or in my experience at the GSA, I haven't seen that myself. So that combined with the number of inputs, combined with, and to Maura's point for the non-academic staff, the striking of, you know, a specific staff consultation group, we are seeing many perspectives brought in. And of course, GFC probably being the most important of that, of which there is healthy representation from the faculty across a broad swath of fields represented there. So it's a really good point. And I would just iterate that, you know, what we're doing is definitely our national context is very different from Australia. Our provincial context is not that different, unfortunately. Our national context is very different from that's occurring in the United Kingdom. For instance, it was just a consultant who, I shouldn't say just a consultant, but they're a consultancy group that had these clients that had worked with these avenues or these entities before and had something to contribute to the overall process. And that's kind of where we're at. And whatever we make of that is what we make of it. And I would hope that we don't, you know, of course, if we have people who are actively engaging in these research areas, even if it's one faculty member, that is worth defending, because obviously they're here and on tenure track with a research group for a reason. And I think that needs to be, even if it's one person, that needs to be weighed, put in the balance, and that should be protected, of course. Coming again from somebody who comes from something of an endangered field within my own department, as an example. So it happens in sciences too, I guess I'll put it that way. So yeah, anyways, that was a bit of a long way of putting about that, you know, I will do everything in my power to ensure what happened at University of Sydney does not happen here, but the indications are good. We do have pretty regular channels of communication, of course, at the working group itself, but also with some of the main players and people who are operationalizing that as well. So, yeah. Okay, so let's cycle back to some of our members who have joined us today. So we are here for an amount of time. I believe we have, I think, another hour scheduled. So, I mean, you have me for as long as you'll tolerate me, I suppose. And was there any other questions or input from some of our members? Maybe Alex, since you've just joined, if you have something that you would like to, that you came prepared with, or that you would like to expand upon. And just to clarify, this has kind of become more of a conversation, back and forth. Even if you just have a take or an opinion on how the process is going, or what you've seen in your neck of the woods, even if it's not necessarily a question for me to answer, I would appreciate those inputs as well. So it's as open-ended as we can possibly make it. And of course, an offer that goes to everybody else who's gathered here too. So if the DEOs have something that they would prefer to chime in, if any of our members have something, please, by all means. I'm not just gonna, sorry, it kind of sounded like I put it just on Alex there, but realistically, anybody who would like to weigh in. Yeah, sure, that sounds good, Alex, you betcha. So I'll just keep an eye on the participants window, and I'll kind of look to the DEOs if they have something they want to contribute to help, you know, keep things rolling a little bit. I would appreciate that.
Mark, I have a question. I think I have discussed it with you earlier regarding the merging of some of the faculties to one group. That was a proposed model, right?
That was, yes. So that's scenario B. So maybe it actually would be worthwhile just to talk about, just in very brief, and I have the interim report here, but just very briefly, just touch on some of the scenarios here. And then once Alex has had a chance to add some of his comments, I'll take the opportunity to respond and maybe add some elements to it. So if anybody has the interim report handy, and I mean, should be on everybody's reading list on their bedside table. It's just absolutely riveting document. Very important stuff in there. Starting on, so for the scenarios, that starts on page, sorry, I'm just trying to locate where that might, oh, here it is. So it starts on page 36 of the document. And we have a couple of different variations with pros and cons and whatnot. So scenario A is called the Health Sciences Consolidation. Essentially just bringing together nursing, School of Public Health, Rehabilitation Medicine, Pharmacy, and Kinesiology, Sports and Recreation. Oh, sorry, just before I go forward. Oh, it's Maura. Yeah, not a problem, Maura. Thank you for contributing, and we look forward to seeing you at council, and you are always welcome to get in touch with us directly, if me in particular, if you have direct feedback, input, we're always really glad to hear from our counselors, so thank you for joining us. But yeah, just while Alex is going through, so yeah, the first scenario is just bringing together nursing, School of Public Health, Rehab Medicine, Pharmacy, and Kinesiology, Sports and Recreation. And the rationale was, you know, it would obviously give rise to potentially new undergraduate programming through that faculty, like kind of like a public health type option. It would allow some level of administrative savings, but really not very much. And of course, the other drawback to that as well is that you're kind of like, you're almost punishing some groups, well, punishing kind of loosely construed. You're putting a lot of focus on certain groups just based off of their sort of like similarities in terms of their doctrines. And there's kind of a question, is that really the most equitable approach? So that's one. Scenario B, which is one that I'll admit my view has evolved on over time, because I do think there's something to this one. I just think it needs some tweaks. But that's the tri-agency alignment, where you would bring together, you know, you'd have health and medical sciences, where you have medicine and dentistry, rehab pharmacy, School of Public Health, nursing, and KSR together. You have natural and applied science, where you bring science, engineering, and AILS together, which, as we described previously, there might be, you know, some friction there that we might want to address. And then you would also have social science and humanities. So of course, these alignments would be under tri-council arrangement. However, it's more, and the rationale for this is, of course, it would offer the greatest level of administrative savings. It would allow for the establishment of really high level, high quality administrative hubs for transactional purposes, for student service purposes, for support services, and what have you. It would be the most disruptive, so everybody would be in the same boat, which, you know, offers some appeal in some ways. just because then, you know, everybody kind of has to buy in to make it work. So then scenario C, which is kind of a consolidated division type model, sort of combines arts and science together. You'd still have that health science one that we described previously. Applied sciences would become engineering and agricultural, life and environmental sciences. But then you'd have sort of a shared division where perhaps education, business, law, native studies, campus Saint-Jean, and Augustana come together, where they would still each have complete authority over their and autonomy, most importantly, around their academic matters, but that they would share certain administrative functions in order to find cost savings that way. So it's kind of like a compromise between scenario A and scenario B. So there's a lot to consider in there, but just kind of wanted to touch on them because you have one where it's like sort of the most minor approach where you just combine some into one and that's all you do. Doesn't save you very much. You have one where you combine everybody together into these great big blocks of faculties, which of course from a cost saving perspective is great, but may introduce friction in ways that we're not, you know, necessarily cognizant of at this time that may have drawbacks. And that's obviously, like I said, it's the most disruptive. Although it could also yield the most interdisciplinary interaction, since it would sort of bring people together who may not have been brought together in that kind of fashion before. And then the last one is kind of a hybrid where you kind of bring some faculties together, you arrange some other faculties into a unit where they share admin functions, and that one becomes a little bit more gray in nature. So it's kind of a hybrid almost. And these are subject to change. These are not set in stone by any means. These are merely models and proposals for what we can go forward with. And like I said, based off of the conversation at GFC, there is certainly a lot of you know, adjustment to be made. So I would also just like to acknowledge that we've been joined by Nicole. So thank you, Nicole. And Alex and Nicole, I'll just let you know that we are recording this for internal processes. So just so that you're aware that it's being recorded in case you'd like to change your name or if you have any concerns about your privacy or things of that nature. So just so that you are aware. Yeah, so anyways, Nicole, just to kind of bring you up to speed at where we're at, we sort of had kind of a wide-ranging conversation about what is academic restructuring, my role as a graduate student representative on that body. I'm sort of here to hear questions, comments, concerns, really anything that you would like to feed into the process that you want me to know and bring forward going forward. So it can, if you're, you know, obviously if you have something that you've come in prepared to discuss, we'd love to hear it. If you have, we will take comments, questions, hot takes, really anything that you have that you would like me to know or respond to, I'm glad to hear them. So just to let you know about our format, this is more of kind of like a focus group. And if questions are not forthcoming, I will turn around and ask some questions of you all that might help sort of guide some of my thinking going forward. So that's kind of where we're at. And I have thought of a question, but I'll hold on to it for now. Let's see here. Okay. I see. Okay, and that's a good point. So if you have additional comments, I'll let you type them out. I'll just sort of begin the process of responding. And so what I would say to that is that they are quite open to modification, especially at the level of General Faculties Council, because General Faculties Council ultimately would have to approve and recommend this to the board. And so therefore, if these scenarios, which are kind of just early stage proposals, bear in mind, and something I should actually comment on, when we were speaking with NAUS, the consultancy group that was assisting with some of the data collection and sharing their experiences with similar work in different jurisdictions, they commented like, look, sometimes restructuring will take place over like, 3-5 years. It's a kind of a long iterative process, sometimes spurred on by budget reductions and things of this nature, fiscal realities. However, there's a little bit more time. What's unique about our circumstances is that we have very severe reductions. Actually, probably they said like these are the most severe budgetary reductions we've ever seen, ever. under the type of time scale. So I'm not going to sit here and do apologetics for the government. They hire people to do that for them. But what I will say is that that's kind of the stage that we're on. So it's happening fast. It needs to happen fast. And that obviously leads a lot of concerns about proper consultation and the quality of the work. That being said, though, they have blocked off like the next 3 General Faculties Councils meetings for discussions, including the one that we just had, for these discussions to ensure that whatever is being brought forward will pass General Faculties Council with their input and consultation, because obviously they have a more nuanced, high-level view of how these things work. So it's not that these are the only choices. What I've viewed them as, and as someone who's kind of been at the table, I would describe these as, here are 3 sort of modes of thought for how, oh, and just to acknowledge, Andre is going to have to depart. Thank you so much. I hope it was helpful, and you're welcome to get in touch with us if you have comments, questions, or need of support. So, and Alex has also answered, so just let me finish my response to Nicole. So these kind of represent modes of thought around restructuring. And I think what's important to mention is that they are really open for consideration. And so just to rehash part of our previous conversation, for example, one of the proposals under scenario B, which is a scenario or at least a school of thought that I personally align with just as my own individual in this process, but that it involves a combination of the Faculty of Science and the Faculty of Engineering. And not to rehash the entire conversation, but there are some very different incentives with the way that those faculties work, and they have not always seen eye to eye with each other on a variety of different topics. And I will say this as somebody who my main supervisor is in science and my co-supervisor is in engineering. So just to make that clear. So it's not that these are the only choices, but that the working group really did, it was a fairly rigorous, robust, long in terms of a number of month process to look at what was out there, whittle down those things that just simply would not work, and come to the university community and come to General Faculties Council with something like, here are some ideas that we could go off of. We need some input. We need to refine these. Of course, as the provost, Steve Dew, has commented, like, we do need to do more exploration in terms of what would some of the numbers look like if we actually built budgets for these entities, getting a finer, more granular view at the cost comparisons or cost savings that can be derived. But realistically, whatever is adopted, it's going to look different than any one of these scenarios. And I will be bringing this forward at the Academic Restructuring Working Group. I think we have a meeting this Friday where I'm going to bring up something that came up at Faculties Council. I was going to be like, look, I know I was supporting scenario B before, and I do think there's some merit to a model like this, but we would have to reconsider. Maybe we don't have 3, maybe we have 5, maybe we have 4, maybe we have 6, or maybe some variation thereof. But we might have to reconsider the way that these are being combined, and that may have to be discussed. So I understand where people are coming from, where they say, we're stuck with option 2. Option 2 seems to have the biggest draw, and it's because option 2 does have the biggest draw as it relates to potential cost savings, but that obviously there are other concerns that need to be brought into the equation and brought into that conversation that have basically just been raised. And like I said, usually we would have, years to do something like this, and we just don't. But that, this process will continue on. We kind of have like this phase right now, which is kind of the emergency, got to get this thing working in a way that allows us to kind of weather what's going to come next and help us build towards it. But what the expectation is that we will be able to change and move, and the university will grow again. This is not a be-all, end-all situation. We just have to set the stage to allow for that growth and for that continued excellence to carry on. I'm going to move on to Alex's comments, and then Nicole, if you would like me to respond to it, please let me know. And Logan, if you have any thoughts that have sort of come up during this time, let me know. So let's see. So I'll just read out Alex's comment here, which is, from what I've heard about departments merging before, both in my own department in science and in other faculties, in those cases, there has been impact on how communication takes place within the newly formed department. There have been instances where department-wide emails get sent to certain program-specific mailing lists and have created some friction, in my opinion. I'm not sure if this is something falling under the jurisdiction of GSA, although I feel such an atmosphere does have some effect on how integrated grad students feel within their departments. And what I would say is that that's, oh, and I'll just continue your comment here. There are some examples of what I feel reflects friction between programs within the same department as a result of merger, but I don't have a very good way of phrasing them without disclosing private information, and that's fair, and we respect that. This is at the moment my primary concern regarding the reconstruction, and I think what you have hit the nail on the head, and I think what you are describing is the sort of really kind of complected, interconnected, sometimes redundant, sometimes not redundant enough communication system that we have at the university. And I think what you're raising is something that I've noticed too, is that sometimes it feels like you're getting all of the information and yet none of the information. It sometimes feels like you're getting information that should be specific to you, but you don't feel like you can really use. And then Nicole has come, I'll get to that in a moment, Nicole, have no fear. And I think I can bring that back because I think what you're touching on is an issue with the way that the organization communicates and basically an audit and curation of the communication methods themselves. You have Students Digest, Grads Digest, Employees Digest. You have, if you're like me, you have emails from the Faculty of Science, Department of Biosci. Of course, the GSA does it, but we're, we very carefully put in information into our newsletters that we know are important for graduate students to know, like this event, for instance. And so what I would comment on is that it's not strictly under our jurisdiction, but I think what you're pointing out is something that we can raise in the context of a sort of academic, institutional restructuring is we have to have a conversation about the way that the institution and the various components therein communicate with people, like students, like graduate students in this case. And that that is going to call for some level during that reorganization process. That is actually probably the time to have those conversations and to engage in that. Because if not now, then when, right? And I think you raise a really good point that we have this proliferation without really too much, how would I say? Sometimes the rationale or justification for those different lines of communication either have sort of lapsed in that they're not serving the same purpose that they necessarily did before, or that, as you say, through combinations, amalgamations, some of them are just artifacts and need to be revisited. So it's a very good point, just on a more broader institutional scale. It's something that we can certainly comment on. So just let me take a note of this. Okay, very good, thank you. All right, moving on to Nicole's comments. So Nicole comments, I think you also need to think about the impact that these divisions will have on the community. Looking at the Alberta government new survey on post-secondary education, they are focused on revenue generation linked to corporatization of research and employment measures. The divisions, especially separating social sciences and humanities research council out, will lead to metric-based budgeting that focuses on grant generation, etc. Since the other two tri-agencies generate revenue and have larger grants and support, I am worried that this will lead to more defunding of social science and humanities that has already happened and continues to happen. And I think that, I'm glad to reiterate, it's just something that we had commented before, but it's important that we sort of continue to develop this conversation. And I you know what, I couldn't agree with you more. And what's funny enough is that there's a lot of people involved in the Alberta Vision 2030 system-wide review that agree with you. And that from my understanding, especially related to issues about commercialization of research, as an example, as somebody who works in a field that is actually a field of research that is commercializable, we do natural gas bioconversions, as an example. Now, I agree with you that is a really important thing, because there's lots of research whose impact on our society in terms of culture, in terms of art, in terms of health and safety and human rights that cannot be quantified through just a pure economic lens. Or if they can, in ways that you wouldn't expect. Just to give you an example, to sort of demonstrate the bridge building, vaccines, which I'm a microbiologist, and vaccines are something that are near and dear to my heart. And the thing is, though, is that you cannot really sell a vaccine. You cannot commercialize a vaccine. It's quite frankly impossible. They're just too expensive to test and produce and ship and all this kind of stuff. But our economy, or our society, and we know this for a fact, would be in much more dire straits if it weren't for vaccines. And so I think that there's something to this where we have to ensure that, and we kind of raised this earlier in the conversation, that maybe we can have a division model, but maybe it should not be aligned along tri-council agencies for reasons that, that for valid and good reasons. And so I think you're right that whatever we do, and this is an active part of the conversation, is like, obviously our restructuring is taking place in the context of the provincial restructuring. And obviously we need to ensure that whatever we develop is for the furtherment of our fields, for the education of both students, both domestic and international, and that whatever it is that we are doing is towards a greater purpose other than, developing a new piece of software for, tracking shipping orders or whatever. I'm taking a bit of a jab at my at computer science there, but I know they do far more work than that. But that's the risk, right? Is that if you put this lens of just sort of unnuanced commercialization of research, you will eliminate the type of research that actually pays advantages and dividends to your economy more broadly. And I think that's part of what you're raising, if I'm not too off base, Nicole, because I agree with you. So I think that what we have to consider is that, if a division model is on offer, we probably need to revisit tri-council justification and try a different route or combination. But I hear you loud and clear. That's certainly something that that I've thought about as well. So follows up, yes, and honestly, we also have to think about whether we trust the administrators, government, and university to actually keep their words when they say things won't happen. In effect, it's not my intent to defund X. And comments, I don't trust them, and we need to ensure that the structures, levels of bureaucracy we put in place do not enable the easy achievement of these backroom deals. Right, and what I would comment on that, and of course we represent a nonpartisan organization, at least at the executive level. We have members of various different political stripes and opinions. But what I would comment on that is that it's probably valid to ask questions about the incentives and direction of the provincial government at this time. I think that's fair and healthy. I think that's a good thing. When it comes to the university, I would say that and I think what you're kind of pointing out, and this is sort of similar to Alex's commentary, which is that, when he kind of touched on, say, like, here, there's this issue of communication that kind of transcends just the issue of it has more to do with a broader cultural thing. When you talk about the issue of trust and mistrust between institutions on campus, and like I said, we represent an association who one of our strategic priorities is ensuring we have accountability measures for supervising faculty who have graduate students in their research groups because of issues related to the treatment of graduate students. So as an example, so I think that I would sort of say two things about this. So one, yes, ask questions of your government, always ensure that you're holding them accountable, always monitor what it is that they're doing and that it's in your interest. Just good things to do no matter who's in charge. When it comes to the university administration though, and this is just kind of my own personal take as someone who's been involved for a little while, and I hope I don't sound like I'm sort of like, shilling in any way, but I think there has been a very definite change in the way that administration, at least at our level, deals with feedback and adds focus to the student experience, and is really trying to do this in a way that is for the betterment of the entire institution. And I'm not necessarily saying that we have to just, trust them at face value. Of course, we have to vet and measure and ask the hard questions and make the right criticisms as we've done here and as what has happened at GFC and other venues. But I think that with President Flanagan, and as someone who I've had an opportunity to meet with him and discuss with him a number of times, all I can say is that I have seen no reason to distrust him or his initiative insofar, and I do think that his leadership style is the right leadership style for this current moment, and that we kind of at some level have to build up some level of trust and collaboration and cooperation between all different types of units on campus. But that as of right now, the process so far from what I've seen from sort of, I mean, I'm involved in it, but I've been asking similar questions that have been raised today at that table. And we do want to ensure that it is robust, that it is proper consultation, that we aren't going to sell out one program or one faculty, especially those in units who, have been underserved historically. And I think that when we're talking about, for instance, equity on campus, it's not just, along sort of like the characteristics of individuals, but it also has to do with the treatment and fiscal realities of, say, even when it comes to doctrines or personnel or what have you. The valence goes much further than I think has been fully appreciated. But it's a really good point, and I do take it on balance and something that we'll bring back, because you're exactly right. We have to ensure that this restructuring process is in a way that benefits the University of Alberta and is not in a way that may leave us compromised when it comes to a system-wide review. So very good. Those are excellent points, and I really appreciate this. I just wanted to comment, if somebody else is sort of thinking, please either put up your hand. I actually have to show the participants window again. Either use your blue hand or add a comment. But I just wanted to say that I do really appreciate this sort of like focus group approach and the opportunity to kind of really engage deeply into some of these matters, and it's been very informative for me and so far. So I do appreciate the input for those currently in the room and those who had joined us earlier on. I might ask a question of Logan, Alex, and Nicole, actually, which is what. So as an example of maybe something that would help me in terms of sort of a guiding question, from your perspective as graduate students at the University of Alberta, what is it that you need to feel included, involved in this process, and to develop that trust in the process? So very broadly construed, what is it that you need in this process? And don't worry, we do have a little bit of time to give it some time to sort of like, properly form in the mind. And I know it might be a question you weren't expecting to be answered coming in. So we'll just ensure that, that you're given a chance to kind of consider that. And if you don't have an answer for immediately, that's okay. If you have other comments, I don't want to, restrain us or filter us to just one point at this stage in the meeting. But just a question that I've asked myself throughout, but also a question that I think is really important to hear back from people, because otherwise it can be difficult sometimes to know what to suggest at a table if you're not necessarily sure what people need. And I know a lot of our conversation has sort of been around, ensuring that the process is going forward properly and needing assurance that the process is being performed properly. That's a big part. Knowing that these are not set in stone, that they are subject to change. Of course, it's going to be revisited, and there's been frequent references that this will be the case, and we'll ensure that that happens. And then we also commented a little bit on the communication piece and also how that can get both confusing just as an institution, but also when you combine, you know, this restructuring process on top of it, that also is something that we need to bring into account as well, which is something I've raised a couple of times at the working group, in fact. So. Okay, and if we don't have an answer to that question specifically, I'll kind of leave it out there. And if you want to respond to it in your time, if you're kind of typing, then that's all fine. I'll come back to it if that's the case. The other question that I might ask, and we've addressed it to a degree. Oh, here we go. Here, let's see. Okay, thank you. Let's see this. Okay, so we need to have a sense of real consultation. Question and answer sessions are not engagement or consultation. Thought exchange is terrible. So far, the opportunities have been people providing, in brackets, negative feedback, and the higher university admin pushing back / explaining. There are a lot of acknowledgements that something has to be done, but no one is asking for other options or ideas, just feedback on the proposal. I have a lot of experience in higher education at a different institution, and this happens everywhere. It's a system-wide issue, and I can certainly imagine that. I'm also worried that it will decimate higher education in general, and as a result, our career prospects. This isn't a real example of consultation, this focus group. Perhaps this should do this for everyone. So what I will comment is I appreciate that last piece there about these focus groups. So maybe this is actually really interesting. If I could actually just sort of kind of just dig in a little bit on that. So I suppose these larger scale events, I think, do lack a sense of some kind of like closeness or you know, some kind of like, you know, the space that they allow is a little bit different, right? Like there's a little bit more of that sort of like, you have like 500 people in a room or something. It's a kind of more like an arena type thing where it doesn't necessarily feel like the safest place to hash out some of these concerns, to further some of these conversations. So is there something about having a more close-knit sort of, focus group type approach that lends itself to a greater sense of authenticity, or at least a better sense that comments are being heard and responded to perhaps more sincerely, for lack of a better word, as opposed to, like I said, like this more like, you know, almost stadium-esque approach where it tends to be a lot of like factions yelling over each other and things of this nature. Is that kind of what we're getting at here? Or if I'm totally off base, please let me know if there's maybe a different perspective that I need to measure into this. Because if this type of if you find that this helps, and if other people find that this helps, then maybe scheduling these sort of more regularly throughout our procedure would be, or throughout our terms here, because we're here until the end of April. Maybe, and that would obviously be something that would continue to whoever succeeds me in this role. But is that maybe something that would have more value, you think? Because that's definitely something that the GSA can facilitate, and maybe it's worth bringing to council. Maybe we should get feedback. Yeah, and so the comment being yes, and there are many ways to get feedback. So far, it has all been very defensive, and I think that I think you're correct that that's the tone that's being picked up. But like I said, I think that what we're starting to see, or what we are seeing quite apparently, is the institutional culture of sort of more of like a sort of zero-sum, non-collaborative sort of you know, very obstructive approach to dealing with conflict beginning to sort of rear. But I understand what you're saying. It's never a good look to appear that you're somehow on the back foot, or that, you know, all this kind of stuff. But that to say that I'm just kind of thinking back on a couple of different meetings where, you know, there is some feedback that is, you know, very prescient and astute and accurate and needs to be taken into account. And then there does sometimes happen to be, sometimes feedback comes in that may either have maybe missed a specific detail or could be legitimately intended to be barbarous, for lack of a better term, non-collegial, maybe we would say. And so I think that you're right, though. It's not really a great look, but just from what I've seen from kind of in different rooms, sometimes there's a question of, was the response that was the problem, or was it the feedback that's the problem? I'm not really going to make a judgment call based on what you have seen, but just saying that, yeah, there probably needs to be a little bit more of a of an openness to that input. So, but you do raise really excellent points, and I think that's something we can absolutely bring into account. And we have another one. So I know there's been a recent flurry of email regarding the restructuring from various levels of administration. This is my first time participating in this discussion and getting an idea of what's going on. What I feel at the moment is that a discussion about this within the graduate student population, maybe within departments, would help towards having fellow grad students exchanging ideas and putting a group effort into reflecting what the restructuring means for their academic career. And I think that, again, this is a very astute comment. And I think that what we've been trying to do, and we've actually seen a lot of success in this year, kind of inadvertently, it wasn't purely intentional, but counselors sort of stepping up and interacting with us and looking to help contribute in a more active role. And our council is really like, because each GSA that exists, and they often are aligned with departments, has a counselor, and so that's a really great venue to facilitate that. And so I think you're right, is that really trying to facilitate that maybe through sessions like this, both internal to graduate students or otherwise. I guess I kind of have to be there because as of right now, I'm probably the graduate student who knows the most about this at this time, and that's kind of a harrowing thought. But I do think that I do think you're touching on something there where there needs to be sort of like a broader sort of like, like conscious raising or awareness raising about it. And of course, like when we hear feedback, like, other than PhD students who can be up to 7 years, master students typically are here between like, 2 to 3 years kind of thing. So in the university scale, it can be argued that in terms of their time on campus, it's not necessarily, there are other groups like faculty, for instance, who, are here for, until they retire. And so, of course, they kind of like, trump, they're sort of higher up on that list than we are. However, as the GSA, and we're really only concerned about graduate students, that's actually where we can fit in and then take those commentary as we're doing here, incorporate it into the messaging that we're bringing to that table while simultaneously raising some level of awareness. And I think that that's a good point. So that's something we'll take into an account and see if there's a way that we can leverage that, because you're right, you're going to start getting bombarded, faculties, departments, it's going to come from everywhere, and it's very quickly going to become deafening in a sense. So moving forward, so this goes back to the previous comments. So right now it's almost like the Academic Restructuring Working Group is a black box. No one knows what goes in or out. I think we can agree that something needs to be done. The question is what and how. Sorry, I just scrolled too low. Oh, there we go. It's alienating. There are a lot of people at the university who do this kind of work, community-based, participant-driven, focused. They didn't need to tap a consultant. They aren't listening to people's concerns. Maybe they need to ask, what do you want to see from people? When someone gives negative feedback, we should ask, I tapped the bar again, sorry. Maybe they need to ask, what do you want to see from people? When someone gives negative feedback, we should ask, what do you think would make it better? Then there would be more input from people and actual productive feedback instead of just negative concerns. And it's funny, I just had a conversation earlier today from a group that's filing another report. And we had a very similar conversation about this, which is like, it's important to provide some level of negative criticism if you see something wrong with a proposal or, whatever is the thing. But if you're not offering an alternative, if you're not constructing something, that is also problematic because, you know, you don't drive out the dark by commenting on how dark it is. You need to turn on some light, and you need to, you know, you actually need to take action to do that. And so I think you raise a really good point, which is, how do we frame this more in a, tell us what you would like to see reflected in this process, not what do you see that's wrong with this process. And sorry, just let me just make a note of that. Because you're right. What I would say with the consultant piece, though, is that it should be noted that really the consultant just provided the information and the data that helped to answer some questions really along sort of the nitty gritty about like who's done this before, how many faculties did they start with, how many faculties did they end with, how many students do they have, what does their research publication record look like, in which fields, and things of this nature. And so I think that I think that it's important that we sort of just recognize what the role of the Nous group was in all of this. And like I said, I don't agree with necessarily everything that they said. And there's people in the working group that didn't, right? Because we all have our own opinions and there are different contexts involved. But I think you're right that moving more towards a open and transparent model. And actually, interestingly, earlier on in the session, I noticed an individual from Faculty of Education, Dr. Jareen Pegg, I believe her name is, Pegg. She actually has invited myself as a student representative to speak on a panel about the restructuring effort. And I'm probably going to accept, and what I think what I'm going to raise is that these sort of more spontaneous, small scale, conversation-based approaches are probably more appropriate than these great big, I think the town halls and the Q&A sessions. And I do think Thought Exchange has a place in those sorts of forums. But that cannot just be the only forum. And that's why, you know, our council has become one of these forums. We would like to set up perhaps more of these as we go forward. Like I said, my successor is probably going to need to follow through with some of this work because it's not going to be completely finished in April, as an example. So this is feedback I can 100% bring back. That alienating piece, I can understand why that's the case. And I would just sort of just revisit the caveat that most of the time, so it's happening really, really fast. And we can acknowledge that this is obviously going to pose some concerns for people, and obviously is going to interrupt or hinder our ability in some sense to ensure that we're doing everything 100% properly. But that realistically, the Academic Restructuring Working Group, that interim report is really the first time that we've had anything to say from our conversations. And so there's sort of an expectation, of course, and it's understandable that we want to see constant lines of communication. We want to see, you know, what's being discussed at every other moment and going forward. And that's totally reasonable and we can understand. But on the other hand, the role of that group is to vet and compare and to sort of like ensure that whatever is being brought forward to the community for discussion, consideration, and modification, most importantly, modification, is something that's actually feasible and doable and has passed that. We're kind of the first check in many ways. And so I would just sort of raise that for consideration as well, that, yeah, it's unfortunate we're on such a tight timeline, but when it actually comes to reorganization efforts, this is actually rather fast for something like an interim report to come out. You may not see something like that until like 2 years into it, and what we're something like 8 months or less. Oh, less than 8 months. Yeah, like over a span of a number of months, we've come out with this report that represents that first milestone in the process. And it seems, you know, I appreciate how that appears from the outside, and that's something we can bring back and do better on. But I also think that this is breakneck speed for a university to move. This is the fastest I've seen the university move on anything. And that really is, yeah, it's the scope of the thing is sometimes misleading. So pre-written or preordained. So just the follow-up comment, and the speed with which the reports are coming out raises people's suspicions that the reports were pre-written and preordained. I do appreciate you taking the time to engage with us. And I appreciate you all taking the time to engage with us as well, because it really does add a lot of value to the work that we do. And we appreciate it as much as you appreciate it in the vice versa. So what I would say is that, and this is obviously like, unfortunately, it's a situation of you might be damned if you do, you might be damned if you don't. And all I can say is that I will bring those concerns and try and do better whenever possible. Because yeah, I can assure you, I know the gentleman who was charged with who physically typing out and writing the draft and formatting it. And some of it came from data from now, some of it came from figures and stuff we had been discussing, but it was all, written for the purpose of the interim report following on months of conversation and consultation that had already taken place. So yeah, it's really threading the needle in so many ways. It's very complicated. But yeah, I'll just reiterate, thank you for sharing your thoughts and opinions, and I will be bringing those forward. I just wanted to comment, while somebody else might be thinking about it, I make this comment frequently, but it's becomes more true as time goes on. I really do love working for graduate students, just because of they are by far some of the most interesting and thoughtful and considerate people to work for and on behalf of, and I do appreciate it a lot. So just want to raise that.
Yeah, Mark, if I may chime in, like with respect to Alex's question regarding like departmental engagement with restructuring. So I can give you an example. At least I'm from the Department of Political Science, and Maura Roberts, the departmental counselor in our council, and also the VP external of the Political Science Graduate Student Association, organized 2 weeks ago a kind of webinar for all of graduate students in the department to come and talk, and that was very, very fruitful. Like, we kind of developed a sense of what is going on. She also organized some sort of solidarity, because a lot of Department of Political Science students do not want this restructuring to affect some staff, like the research coordinator, the administrative staff that always do all the work, more than the faculty themselves. So that was really fruitful. And I think this is the council is the place for us to start. Maybe this is something we can bring to our council. And then, yeah, the departmental councillors can always organize these things at departmental level. And at the Department of Political Science, I would say that was very successful, at least from my perspective.
And that's where the value of grassroots organization, actually, you just said that. And yeah, see, and Alex, you can go and do this. And if you do schedule, and if you want me there, we can schedule that together, and I'd be glad to come in for it, of course. But that's kind of what we're talking about, that at some level, if we want these conversations to take place on our terms, we're going to have to arrange the spaces for them to have those conversations. And actually, this is really great, because I'm going to be joining a panel next week, as I commented earlier, where this is going to be part of that conversation. And I think this is another really great venue to bring this kind of input forward to, because yeah, like, if we want to have these conversations, we want to be involved. And Alex and Nicole Logan, like, if there's something that you can do, or if you want to connect with your GSA and either have it within yourself or have me present as the representative, we can make that work with enough notice, just for scheduling purposes, of course. But like, please keep us in mind if you choose to do that, because yeah, I've gleaned a lot of value from this conversation today, and yeah, it's helps. It helps a lot. Yeah, it's a good point, Anis. It's always great to hear about. Every time I hear about grassroots graduate student advocacy, I'm always just like, yes, more of that, please. Okay, so with that in mind, we have about 15 minutes left. So I think we've really covered a lot of ground, and I have a lot to digest from all of this. But you still have me for another 15 minutes, and so we're glad to continue this conversation up until then, if there's anything else that needs to be arranged. And actually, I've just been just as a note, I'm also affiliated with the with a faculty level grad student association in the Faculty of Science, and I'll be reaching out to them and asking, hey, maybe your student groups would like to do something like this, and we could kind of set up our own sort of roundtable thing in the time that I have in office, because I think that we're now ready to have those conversations. At least I hope so. I still feel like there's so much that I just don't know. Okay, so we'll just leave a little bit of space here just in case there's other comments or thoughts to go forward with. What I'll do, that's my presidential email address, so a place to contact me if you want to follow up, or if you need my attention on something to schedule, if you want me present for a meeting like that or a roundtable like that. And so on. So maybe you'll find that helpful. But we'll give a couple more minutes here for people who may have other thoughts or comments, and yeah, we'll go from there.
Mark, I have one question.
Sure.
So this is related to course-based students. So when you're combining two departments into one department, so there will be chances of removing some of the courses, maybe from one department or another. So how they are going to decide, like, from which department we have to remove some courses for that?
So as of right now, the issue of departmental mergers has not been raised. And so, and I don't know necessarily how feasible it is, depending on where you're talking about, because really a lot of departments are sort of established along specific disciplinary lines. And so when it comes to that, programs are different than departments. Departments house programs, and obviously the members of the faculty of that department are responsible for those programs. So realistically, if a program has continued to operate, it has enrollment, it has students, it has faculty who can maintain it, update it, and so on and so forth, it will continue on in more or less a similar form. There are a lot of, at least when I was in my undergrad, in my specialization, as I indicated before, my specialization no longer exists in my department. There was a problem actually of orphaned courses later on, where people would, like obviously faculty would move on or retire or what have you, and you would still have elements of your course requirements for courses that no longer existed. So there's going to need to be some auditing, but honestly, if a course or a program is still being used, still has enrollment, I can't imagine that, and I don't know 100%, but my intuition is that they will not, they're not just going to start cutting programs or courses willy-nilly. It's going to be that, this one hasn't had any enrollment for X number of years, or this one only has 2 students left in it, or this professor who's the last person who's managing this specific one is planning on retiring, or what have you. Those would more likely be the conditions, I would say. So of course there are going to be some smaller programs that will need to, that discussion will need to be had about how is it going to be sustainable into the future. But for graduate programs, just because it's, even at the course-based level, there's a level of specificity there, and maybe there might need to be some auditing and some potentially, working through what we have, and is the catalog up to date? Are there some courses that are no longer being used, and all this sort of stuff that needs to be questioned. But if a student is in a program, they will see the end of that program. That from my understanding, that is standard operating procedure for anything having to do with the course suspension process, which I just found out recently, bear in mind, at the General Faculties Council Academic Planning Committee. So, because lots of people are doing lots of work on this. So when that happens, of course, there's obviously the issue of, an important comment, which is, what about, people to have access to that course going forward? to ensure that it's being preserved as its own essential. Yes, that's right. And we just had the comment, a legal requirement that once you are admitted as a student, the university has to see that student through. They can change the course requirements though. So swap one course to the other course. And that's what happened to me a couple of times during my undergraduate. So yes, so those students will be covered. Like I said, the question is like, you know, the preservation of a niche or specialized program for future generations and whatnot, to which I would say, I agree with that statement. I just don't know if it's, I can't really, I guess it's just really not up to us is what I would say. We can advocate for it, those students can advocate for it, but at the end of the day, if the students are admitted and they're able to complete, and it's of course, you know, the quality that they expect and are paying for, of course, then it's really hard to justify to the university to maintain a course that, unfortunately, due to financial situation, is not necessarily sustainable anymore. So, which is regrettable, and I think it's too bad that we're put in that position. Yeah. Very good. So we have about 9 minutes left, and so kind of just sort of, I think it's probably good to begin sort of the off-ramp of this conversation. And what I would say is that, so I really appreciate the feedback that I've been granted today. There was a lot of, oh, sorry, there was just another piece of that one comment. Normally what happens when departments merge and they remove courses for duplication is that both courses are removed and a new one is developed. If a department merges, a new course code might be created for those courses, like education for general ed classes, bridge all the educational departments. But that is generally at department level. The issue for the GSA is what happens with TAs in those situations. Correct. And we are doing, and Umesh specifically, but also through other conversations about graduate student compensation and stipend, we are, you know, obviously wanting to ensure that graduate students, all graduate students, have access to, you know, suitable, appropriate, upfront funding at the beginning of their programs, and that's something we've been working rather diligently on for a number of years now. So, but yes, that's a good point. It's a complicated affair, with the hope that when that process happens, that whatever results is, you know, at least equivalent to the sum of the parts or greater, as it were. But yeah, that's a very complicated problem. It's a good question though. Good. Anyway, so sorry, back to my off ramp of this conversation. So yeah, just wanted to say, I really appreciate the feedback. I think this is a model that can work pretty well. When we were having the management meeting this morning, we were kind of discussing whether, like, you know, if X number of people show up, we'll run it as like a focus group town hall type thing, or sorry, a focus group type thing. If more people are in, we'll run it as a town hall kind of thing. And I'm actually kind of glad that it turned out this way, because it really allows us to, like I said previously, engage in a more nuanced, substantive, and deep way. And my understanding from the comments that we have received, that it seems to be a winning combination. And I believe that there's room for both. And I think that the university should obviously entertain both. There's a merit to a larger scale town hall Q&A community, broad level broadcasting approach, versus a more sort of like a setting like this that's, like I said, more substantive, more nuanced, allows for deeper conversation. And so I think we can definitely take both of those into account. I think some of the comments related to communication, related to how this interfaces with the provincial government's review, how the university can solicit feedback, or how the Academic Restructuring Working Group can solicit feedback in a more constructive way. How, there's a couple of other things here too. Knowing that these proposals are not set in stone, and they are subject to some, well, not just some modification, but they are really subject to, you know, specifically General Faculty Council's input and the perspectives of those primarily academic leaders, but also student leaders as well. There's a lot of questions for communication and how that's going to roll out, and that's linked to that issue of soliciting feedback and input and transparency. And then fundamentally, what does this, and what I'm probably most interested in this whole part, it's all important, but what I'm really interested in with a restructuring process like this is what will this mean for the graduate student experience after it is completed? And it is my job and my obligation and my responsibility to ensure that it is the highest quality with the highest level of equality in terms of funding, programming, quality, accountability, and so forth that we can drive. And I have very high expectations of the university in that regard. So yeah, I mean, I think we should probably close it there, because honestly, that's it's a lot for me to consider and go over, and I'm grateful for it. And thank you for everyone who stuck with us all the way to the end. I think that might be Logan, because I believe Alex and Nicole, you kind of joined us partway through, and that's great. Logan stuck it all the way through, and thank you. I hope it was informative. And if you decide that you want to start having conversations with your own groups, setting up events, I'm your representative on this. Please let me know if you want me there, or if you want to follow up with me with feedback on those communication with those conversations, because I do think that level of grassroots organization from graduate students to have those conversations on their own terms is valuable in of itself. So that's what I would leave out on. So I serve at your pleasure, as it were, and I would like to always make sure that we're available for your concerns. Yes, I know the CN talk and everything. So it is what it is, and we'll do what we can. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm not necessarily chairing a meeting, but this focus group is adjourned. I appreciate everybody's time. So please take care. Be safe. Be healthy.
Thank you, everyone.